Welcome to Pre-Primary Sources. I'm Liz Nolasco. I'm here with Alexandra Dutton, who is host of the Fireside Chats on the Young Mind podcast, as well as a program director at Old Firehouse School for 18 years. And she is also an instructor in the early childhood department at Diablo Valley College. And we are here today because in her many roles, she is an expert in the role of the teacher as a researcher, particularly within the Reggio Emilia approach, and also, her experience mentoring educators in both of her jobs. So I wanted to really start by asking you about how you see the role of the teacher as researcher, just kind of where that takes you as a thought.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And it was so fascinating to think about teachers researcher, because that was such a big part of my program at my master's program at SF State. And what I love about Reggio Emilia and project-based learning and emergent curriculum is that it kind of forces you as an educator to always question what am I doing? Is this the right way to go about this learning in for this particular group, for this particular child? Like you're just always having to question things. And I think that's such an important piece, instead of getting comfortable with, well, I did this last year and it worked, so I'm going to keep doing it. And what I think we find in our project work at Old Firehouse School is that every year there's going to be a different group of children. Well, not necessarily a different group of children, but they grow up, or they change, or there's a couple of new students, and just the children are going to be interested and wanting to do different things, while at the same time we as adults know they are still going to need to learn, some independence or autonomy, or self-regulation, or, some of the early academic skills. Like there are things that are going to be part of their learning, regardless of kind of the group of children, just because of development, that they're kind of all going to go through these different developmental stages. And because we can take the time to really learn about each way that each child learns, we can also take a lot of what they are interested in, or how they learn, and how we as teachers want to work with them into account when we're planning curriculum. So it's something, I think my very long answer to the question is just that project work really allows you and makes you think about what happens in the classroom on a regular basis, and that you are always really staying and adhering to what the children need versus what you as the adult think has to happen, which sometimes are not the same.
Yeah. So putting on your director hat for a second, what sort of structural support do you think educators need to be able to start on this path or really do it well?
They need someone to talk to. I think that's the number one thing. Whether that's a co-teacher or whether that's a director, they need someone to bounce ideas off of. And for some teachers, I know that that's not something they're used to, or they're not comfortable with it. But you can't do this work and just be in a classroom by yourself and think, I'm doing everything right all the time. And even if you are doing a lot of things right, there are times where you're like, oh wow, I could have handled that differently. But if you don't have someone to talk to, you're not going to know, well, what could I have done differently, or why didn't that work? Like that circle time idea or that sensory table thing, I really was excited about it, and the kids were interested in it, or they did this and I didn't expect that. And if you're not able to talk about that, then you're not going to be able to learn as much as you could if you talk to somebody about it. And it can, again, be someone that you're working with in the classroom. It can be someone else that works with that same age group, but it needs to be someone who knows a little bit about what your goals are, that hopefully there's some familiarity with the philosophy and the way that you are interested in teaching. And hopefully together you can kind of learn from each other. And it's not that the other person is telling you, well, you should have done this instead. It's just allowing you to talk about, I tried to do this and it didn't work, or I want to try this thing that I saw, but I'm not sure if it's going to work. And then just allowing all the ideas that you have, or the fears that you have, or the frustrations you have, to come out and have someone else kind of just support you through that process. And so I think that's the first thing. You really have to have someone who can partner with you on that. And for my teachers, a lot of the times it's me. It's Alex, I have a question about my project, or I don't know what's happening with my project, or this thing happened in the classroom. I wonder why that happened. And sometimes again, it is their co-teacher. And the other piece that is very hard, I think, logistically, and I feel this in my bones all the time, is do you have time for those people to talk? That it's not a 5-minute conversation while you're all in the yard or while everybody's actually sleeping. You have to find a way to carve out some time. And we've learned that there can be lots of ways to do that. Sometimes it's, once a month, doing, a half-hour meeting once a month. We've learned, through Zoom, or just, all of these ways that you don't have to be in person too. Like you can do a phone call, you can do a Zoom meeting and meet with other people too. And all of those ways are so important to help you learn, not help you feel so isolated in a classroom, that you are able to grow, that you're with like-minded educators, and that the goal is for everyone to grow.
Absolutely. When you're starting with new teachers or talking to educators about how they kind of implement this idea, I think one of the hangups that I've seen has been finding a question to answer, right? Because part of that research is just starting with a question of what do the children need at this moment, which is a huge question, and then kind of narrowing that down to the individual, the group, the ages and stages that are represented in your classroom. Do you have, I don't know, words of wisdom, advice, ways that you've kind of framed that to make it a little bit less terrifying and intimidating for new educators?
For newer teachers, we do try to narrow it down in the beginning, where it's maybe just like, tell me about circle time. If you do, if you're doing circle time with a group of 3 and 4-year-olds, like, tell me what that looks like. Or sometimes it's, what are some of the places in the classroom that children are really drawn to? Or what are areas in the classroom that nobody seems to ever go? And why do you think that is? And those, like, very specific questions help teachers see so many other things. So it's like, there's nobody that's hanging out in our garden area. Well, why? Because right now it's just an empty planter box. Of course, nobody wants to hang out in there. And that led to, in one of my classrooms, the teacher deciding, like, wow, this is a big kind of waste of space, that children are just, all they do in there is, dig in the dirt, and there's not anything that's really happening besides someone goes in there for a few moments, digs in the dirt, and then leaves because it's not very interesting. And she happened to have a parent who was a gardener, and she asked, I really want to invigorate the space. Can you help me with that? Like, I'd love for the children to use this space in a different way. And I am not a gardener exactly, so I'm not sure how to do that. And together they had this amazing gardening experience for the children. And that has led to us actually harvesting our own lettuce the last several weeks. We have broccoli now, we have snap peas, we have all these beautiful things that are growing, and the kids are so respectful of the garden. They take care of it. It's really been amazing to see the transformation of how, a teacher's idea of, like, this space is really sad looking. Like, we need to change this. And how can we change it in a way that's going to be more of a long-term change, versus just like, maybe, we'll use it as a sensory pit, which we've done before too. But again, like, that doesn't always last, or it still doesn't look very appealing all the time. But turning it into a garden space has actually been quite amazing. So that was one way that a teacher had an idea that it turned into something else. And it started from a very small question of, I want the space to look nicer and to be more inviting for the children.
I love that. I love the role of collaboration here too, right? Because presumably the children had some idea of what plant. You didn't say what age group this was, but I'm
Yes,
assuming 3s,
three-year-olds.
4s. Okay.
Mm-hmm, threes.
Yeah. So they have some idea that plants grow, and then collaborating with that family member who was able to bring it to fruition and really work alongside the educator, right? And finding that outside expertise, finding the people who are the subject matter experts to work with them. I'm
It's so important. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious how that that philosophy has taken root, right? Like how you've empowered your educators to work with the families so closely.
That is, I think, somewhat built into the kind of school that we are. We do a lot of things in the beginning of the year to make sure parents understand like this needs to be a partnership. We want to work with you. We want to get to know you. Please, come into the classroom. No, don't just stop at the door. Like come in, have a seat, like get to know us. You're trusting us with your baby. So please, like we want to get to know what your hopes and dreams are for your kids. So we do a lot of that in the beginning of the year. Our school does home visits, as you know. We do orientations in the classroom. We just do a lot of things to help the parents feel that there's some way they can connect with us. So that's something that, not every year for sure. I have a parent who decides I'm going to help you take on this huge gardening project. But we often have parents who want to support and help and step in a lot of ways. And it's come up in lots of fun ways too. Like we've had projects that we had a music project where it turns out one of our parents had been an opera singer. We didn't realize she was an opera singer. And we had a project that children were studying music because they love dancing and music a lot. And she came in and she sang opera. And we had a teacher, I'm sorry, a parent who was also a concert pianist. So, we find sometimes very naturally, just like, oh, there are lots of skills that all of you have that you probably didn't realize we would want in the classroom. But it's so nice to have a community of families that does have a lot of different skills. And even if you're not an opera singer or a concert pianist, like you probably like to cook or bake or maybe like want to read books with kids. So sometimes it's just that too, like offering that as a possibility of we love having parents in the classroom, come and read your favorite book to the children on Friday at 9:30 and scheduling time for that. So there's a lot of different ways we've had it happen, and it is so important to also just build such a strong sense of community and trust.
That's so wonderful. And I think maybe there are people listening to that going, oh, my group of kids would never sit and listen to an opera singer, right? So again, it's going back to that idea of researching the children that you have and their interests and what they want to be participating in and making it accessible to all of the children in that way, rather than prescribing like, oh, this is the year that we're doing a music unit and it's going to culminate in an opera performance from a family member going to the opera, right? Which is not necessarily appropriate for all children.
And because the children wanted to study music, and obviously this is not about studying notes or anything, it was more about being exposed to music of all different kinds. And I promise you that when we had that concert pianist and the opera singer come in, it ended up being, of course, like the entire school wanted to see what this was about. So we had 60 children, including 1 year olds, sitting enraptured. Like it was new. They hadn't heard it before. And they were so fascinated by the way that music could sound in the way, different than what they had heard. So I think that I think we have to give kids a lot of credit too. Like it might feel, we always have a little bit of our adult lens of like, oh, that's not going to work. Or this is, this gardening, this music, this idea of going to the library and studying birds. Like, nope, none of those things are going to work. Like the kids are too little for that. They're not interested. But when you have a topic that the children are already interested in and fascinated in, then it's really easy to get them to be engaged. And they are, because they're already wondering about it and they're already interested in this topic. So it's not very hard.
Right. I love that. I'm curious too, so thinking of the role as teacher as researcher, I think a lot of us also consider when we have children who may have identified special needs, we might suspect that they might need additional support. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit to the way that interacts, right? The idea of a teacher who has a knowledge base of what typical development looks like and what
Mm-hmm.
sort of extra supports are typical for the classroom, for that age group, for these children, and when it seems like something might be a little bit beyond what can be done in their classroom.
What I hope for all teachers is that they can approach any challenge with curiosity. Because if you can approach it with curiosity instead of, this kid is driving me crazy, or this parent just doesn't get it, then you are already more open to what the possibilities are. So if you have a child that is, new to your school, but it's like week 8 and they're still crying every day and they're 3.5 years old, and you're like, I wonder why this is happening. And I wonder what is going through, her brain, or what are the challenges of this for this child, that allows you to, think of it more as a, like, how can we solve this problem? Like, what do I think might be happening? What are some things I know about this child already? And it's just such a different place to explore a problem. And that can go with children who are neurodiverse as well, or just are going to, engage in activities differently. It might be like, okay, it's circle time. This child, isn't able to or interested in sitting for all of circle time. I wonder why. And if you know that the child is neurodiverse, it's like, well, there's your answer. Like, this particular aspect of neurodiversity is making it hard for the child to focus. So if you find the answer to that question, then the other question is going to be like, okay, so what can I do to either keep that child engaged, or do I change my expectations of what the child has to do in my classroom? Um, I think it, again, just allows you to question and not feel like everyone has to do the same thing all the time, and give you space to understand, like, there's, every child needs different things, and that's okay. And that if I am coming to this from a place of like, this is too much time for this child, so I'm going to allow this child to sit to the side, so that if they need to go, like, I'm going to have a plan that this child can go sit in this other area, or that we have our float teacher who happens to be available at this time can take that child and let them go run outside for a little bit. That maybe you come up with a different plan. But I think it's just always wondering and approaching with curiosity rather than blame, or rather than, frustration in yourself, or shame of like, I clearly am not a good teacher because I can't make this happen. It's like, well, let's think first, like, what is it that's not working, or what is it that you could try differently?
Right. I love that idea of making the shift externally, right? Getting curious about the behaviors that you're seeing or the interaction that you're seeing, and then getting curious within yourself, right? So it's not, I'm a failure. It's not, oh, this class is terrible. It's not, maybe I am not as good a teacher as I thought. It's figuring out what you still have to learn, and kind of asking yourself those questions, and reflecting on your learning that way.
I feel like, oh,
Mhm.
well, I also feel like in some ways, like, approaching things with curiosity just also allows the teacher to almost kind of revitalize their own practice of reflection. And that sometimes you do get stuck in something that isn't working. But when you approach things with curiosity about, again, whether it's a curriculum piece or a parent interaction or a child that's struggling, like, it helps you think a little differently about that work. And then in some ways also really helps you feel like, oh, like, okay, I can try this, I can do this, or part of it is me letting go of this expectation. And I think that helps a lot of teachers also feel like, there's not just one way to do things, even if I am a teacher who's been doing this for a long time. And 95% of the time, this thing has worked. For this one particular instance, it's not working. So I need to learn something new. And I think anytime we learn something new, we're just adding to our tool belt as teachers. And we're learning a new way of thinking about something, or a new way of doing something. And that's just going to mean down the road, when you have this experience again, because you probably will, you're like, oh yeah, with this other child or this other, you know, difficult challenge, like, we tried this and it worked. So I think that it's always good to help teachers also feel excited in some ways about, like, this is a new thing that we can try, and hope that it will help in the classroom or help you as a teacher.
I think that says so much to the importance of that relationship with peers and your director too, right? If your relationship with your director is either adversarial or you're trying to prove yourself, and rather than one where you can say like, I am really having a problem, and you can trust that your director won't, well, what's wrong with you, like this is what are you doing wrong, someone who can support and help and kind of and ask questions, and ideally has the time to observe what's going wrong, but that's in a perfect world where everyone is present one day. but
Right.
um, but that role of support, because you can't be an individual researcher, right? You have to work within that community of people who know what you're doing, who believe in you, who respect you enough to let you kind of try new things and experiment
Mm.
with your approaches.
And I mean, you think of research papers and books and whatever, like, yes, there might be a main author on it, but there were a bunch of editors, there were other people involved. And that's the same thing in a classroom setting where, yes, you might be the main teacher, but you are hopefully bouncing ideas off of a lot of different people. And I remember once one of my dear friends and teachers asked me, Alex, what do you do all day? Because as like a teacher in the classroom, she's, I can see what she's doing. And a lot of the times, she's seeing me in a meeting or she's seeing me like on a computer. And it occurred to me as I was trying to like answer her question, I'm like, I'm talking to you all day long. Like, because the moment you leave my classroom after you're telling me about a struggle you had, well, I promise you another teacher is going to come in not 10 minutes later than you, or just ask like, I have a project that I want to work on, what do you think about this and this. And so that is actually a lot of my day, is talking with teachers, and sometimes about curriculum, sometimes about personal things, sometimes about work that they're trying to figure out. And I that's it's so much fun for me to support them on this journey. I'm not always giving everybody answers, because that's not what everybody needs. Sometimes it's just like, like I have some ideas or some thoughts, or here's what I see from my perspective. And it's important for teachers too to understand, like, when you're living in a thing and you're seeing something happen and it feels like it's happening every 2 minutes, and then you talk to somebody else, a co-teacher, director, or someone else, and they're like, well, actually, he had a really good, half hour outside where he was successful and he did this and this. Or, yeah, that one circle time moment was hard, but what's going well is all of these other things. It's hard for a person who's living in it to see those things. And we have that negative bias, right? So we're always looking for what isn't going right. And sometimes it takes somebody else to go, actually, this all went great. This all went wonderfully. And like, please give yourself some credit, and let's focus on what's working well and do more of that, instead of just hitting your head against the wall about this one thing that didn't work. Like, okay, that didn't work, so maybe we don't do it anymore, let's do something else. But that is so much of, like you said, with like that needing a director or some sort of support. Like, you kind of need someone to help you on this process. Like, it should not be where you're by yourself, and whether you have a mentor, teacher, or something, you just need somebody else. And that's also how you're going to keep growing and keep learning.
Absolutely. I think the other piece that's been kind of bouncing around in my head, and I hope I say this in a way that makes sense. I think in part of that collaboration needs to be kind of what you were saying before about lenses, right? How we're viewing things,
Mm-hmm.
being aware of our own biases, right? Whether that is knowing the backgrounds that the children are coming from, or understanding, what different children need, or seeing, having a child come in and knowing that they have, a label on them, right? Like, this child is autistic or whatever else might be going
Mm-hmm.
on. And working to working with what you know and what you've observed, and also poking holes in your own biases and working with others to make their biases more clear, right? When you have that teacher
Mm-hmm.
who has issues with every boy in their class, and
Yeah.
you're asking, perhaps that is a specific gender bias, and sort of how do you have those difficult conversations where you're saying like, oh, I think you're maybe putting a little more on this than is there.
I think in those cases, it's not always saying you're being biased against boys outright, but it's noticing, like, you have great interactions with this child or this family, and what is hard about this particular child or children or this family that you're struggling with, and maybe teasing apart some of some of the struggles that are happening. And sometimes it's, like, well, they expect me to do this and this, and that's just not what we do here. And then we're like, oh, so there's a cultural difference, or there's an expectation of how they're raising their child, and we are, in a school in California, we're not going to do things quite that way. Okay, so there's a difference in expectation, and there's never a wrong like expectation that a family has, or like culturally, like, I mean, most of the time, like, a cultural difference is just that, it's a difference, it's not right or wrong. And so sometimes it's naming that, like, okay, so this is what the actual issue is that you are feeling an extra amount of stress because they are expecting you to, act this particular way as a child, which is not something that generally in our culture we do. hmm and then not even necessarily solving the problem for them, but just pointing out and letting them sit with that too, of like, oh, okay, it's a cultural difference. Okay. And sometimes that even just gives them a little bit more empathy, or a little bit more like, oh, yeah, when the girls are playing rough, like, it happens so infrequently, I don't mind it. But the boys playing rough reminds me of, I don't know, when I was a child, and my brothers played rough with me and I really didn't like it. Like, sometimes those things come up and you're like, oh, So if it's not comfortable for you, but it's still developmentally appropriate, I wonder, how we can figure that out. Or, maybe just sit and observe, and stop saying anything about the children, what looks like to you rough housing, and just really keep an eye on if they're actually hurting each other. And if they're not, it's just like you having to really recognize and reflect on what makes you comfortable. And these are conversations I also have in my classes a lot at in the community college, because students who are teachers often come to me asking, similar things of like, what about this, and often it's, again, not me solving the problem for them, it's just trying to help them understand, like, okay, well, what are you doing when this is happening, and what are you feeling when this is happening, and even just sometimes doing actual exercises in the classroom where we're doing, like, okay, stand up if you think children should be allowed to jump off the top of the slide in a playground. And just even noticing, like, oh, notice like how many of us are feeling like, yeah, we'd be fine with it, and many of us are like, nope, or okay, that's a little extreme, but like, who would feel okay with the rule that you can go up or down the slide. Like, sometimes just pointing out that we have differences in what our level of comfort is, or what we perceive as being safe, is enough for people to start recognizing, like, okay, I have a different idea about this, or perception, or a bias about, like, what is the right way to feed a child, or the right way to help a child go to sleep, or the right way to, set a boundary or something. Like, it's starting those conversations.
Right. I think that kind of goes with the idea of observing and documenting. And right, we have this idea as educators that these should be as objective as possible, right? It's hard to have it completely objective, but being able to really lay out what you're seeing and the assumptions that you're making that are paired with that, whether they're based on your own
Right.
experience or whether they're based on fears, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're seeing boys roughhousing or girls exhibiting social aggression, it's not leaping straight to labeling, bullies or rough or whatever. It's really seeing what the need is, and how you as the educator can support that need and help them grow with and through it.
And biases are something that we are always having to confront, and it takes a lot of practice. And I mean, as a school this year, we are actually doing a lot more work on anti-bias education, which is encouraging just conversations and ideas and things. But those are things we always have to figure out, that, like, why do we jump to this conclusion with this particular family or this particular child? And it's something that does come up. And I think allowing for an environment that is supportive and communicative, and not going to judge you for being a bad person for thinking about this about a child, is at least going to open the door to talking about it. And then we can move forward from there.
I love that. Yeah. Returning to that idea of collaborating non-judgmentally and being able to talk openly and really
Mm-hmm.
voice what you're seeing, what you think you're seeing, what you're thinking about, what you think you're seeing, and having that structural support ideally within your school. But I'm sure there are educators who are listening who are going, that is not the way my program works, but I would love to find somebody like that within my community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think my last question for you, unless um, there's a thread that you want to pick up that we might have dropped, is how do you start teachers, I guess, both feeling comfortable with reflective practice and um, we talked a little bit about some of the questions that you asked, right? Narrowing down the idea of reflecting on what they're seeing. But within their
Mm-hmm.
own practice, are there some ways that you've really been able to successfully draw educators' attention to things that maybe they haven't noticed, or ways to see what they haven't seen before? Does that make sense?
I think so. And I think what kind of my idea first of like how to start this, the idea of reflective practice is at least, again, kind of going back to just the philosophy of our school being a Reggio Emilia inspired project based emergent curriculum, like that is kind of built in to the work we're doing. We're always going to have to ask ourselves, is this what the kids are actually interested in? Is this actually what's happening here? We have our own ideas of, it's the beginning of the year and I want to make sure that our group feels connected and feels excited to learn and feels safe in the classroom. And so those are like our teacher lenses of like, how am I going to do that? And then the like what it actually looks like in the classroom is going to be individual, really, because the teachers are going to have their own ways of building community and routine and connection. And just based on those kind of goals in the beginning, like, you have these goals in the beginning, but then those goals hopefully will be met, that by the time it's October they are feeling connected and safe and they're playing and engaging really well. So whatever we have done in the beginning of the year to make those things happen, and we talk about that a lot as those beginning weeks are going on, like then you have to move on into something else. So because those goals are no longer valid now we have different goals. Now it's, what are the kids really interested in, what are they playing, or everybody in the 2-year-old classroom wants to pretend to be a baby. What's that about? Like, how do I, is it something we are going to base a project off of, because this is such a theme that's coming up. And so I think I am lucky, obviously, to be in a school where this is going to be happening regularly. But even if you're not in a project based school, the goals of the children are similarly just going to change. You as a teacher are going to have different goals throughout the year. They're going to shift because the children are going to change. They're going to need different things. And so you just have to make sure you're like aware of that and know that, like, and maybe just from the outset say, my goal for the first part of this year is to build, is to make sure that we can at some point sit for circle time for 10 minutes with a group of 3-year-olds. Like, maybe that's my goal. And how am I going to get to that goal? Like, I'm not going to start off with 10 minutes. I'm going to start off with 5, and I'm going to, maybe make sure that I'm doing a really fun book or a really fun song. Actually, no, I'm going to leave the book out because the book will take 8 minutes to read. So maybe I'm just going to do songs and like a fun finger play and a fun, game that will make us connect to each other. So we have to look at each other, and then we're going to stretch it out later and later. But I think just you as a teacher have to have a goal at first to know what you're going to do. And there have definitely been times where a teacher in my school may feel like, I'm not sure what's going on. And often when I talk to them, like, or they're feeling like a bit of malaise maybe about like how things are going in their classroom, they're just like, well, things are fine, like, yeah, circle time's fine. And it's like, what's your goal? Like, those are the moments where I feel like you don't know what to focus on for whatever reason. Maybe you just finished a project or a curriculum, unit or something that feels like it had an ending, and now you're like lost in the the ocean of what do I do next. And it's when I talk to those teachers and I kind of help them nail down, like, well, what do you think's, what do you think's going to happen next? What do you think the kids are going to need next developmentally? And then it's like in 2 weeks, they're like, oh my gosh, Alex, this happened. And then this happened. And then this happened. And then we did this and we had this great project. And it's like, oh, okay. Like there it is. There's your spark. There, you found it. But sometimes if you don't have that, you're not sure what to do. So I think any teachers, again, just need to figure out, what is it that they're interested in doing with their group, with a particular child, with their classroom, with their colleagues. Like there has to be some sort of vision in place. Not that and it should be a very attainable one at first. Like getting the kids to feel connected to each other, getting to have a successful circle time. Helping the group. It shouldn't be. Where am I going with this? And I'm going to cough. So hold on. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I feel like I think that's why we start with narrowing the teachers down a little bit with their questions, because if we don't narrow it down, then it just feels like, how do I run a successful classroom? It's like, well, we can't just answer that question. We have to break it down into tiny, tiny pieces. So let's break that down and then go from there.
Right. I think that some of the complication of teacher's researcher is the teacher is not only researcher, the teacher is also the only variable they can control within the classroom. And so if you're only focusing on your role as researcher, you're kind of doing an incomplete job as an educator, even though that is a lot of work just on its own, right? You need to be able to introduce all of these different techniques, the different ideas, and create all these changes that you then research and read up on and observe and document on your own.
And I think it can be very overwhelming at first, because sometimes as a researcher, our question is too big. And it just makes me think back to when I was in college and all of the times teachers were like, we need to narrow this down. I'm like, really? Like that seemed like a good research question. But once you narrow it down and you can focus on just that few minutes, or that one child or something, then it really does allow you to have just more understanding of what's going on. And again, like it kind of revitalizes you. Like it makes me think back to when I did my thesis on literacy with 2-year-olds, which my professor was like, that's too broad. I'm like, oh, okay. And then eventually went down to like using literacy to build empathy in 2-year-olds, and which felt, yeah, very specific, but also was like, oh, I can totally see what's happening now when I read this book and it helps a child go, oh, she's sad, just like Dante was sad yesterday because his mommy had to say goodbye. I'm like, you're right. And like those things are like, now I can really focus on like, yeah, it's not just all literacy in 2-year-olds. It's like, oh, this little tiny thing. And with my teachers and the way that they do project work, it's really beautiful when that happens, when they have those things where it's like, we figured out this, this way to build our love of taking care of plants and gardening by, again, like that one idea of just like, I want to make the space a beautiful, engaging space for children. And it wasn't the whole yard. It was like, here's a planter box that is just ugly. I want to fix that. And figuring out that tiny thing led to all sorts of other things, so much self-regulation, so much science, so much learning about the plants and growing and sensory exploration. And so I think you'd be surprised when you focus a little bit more deeply on one idea or topic, how it actually opens doors into other aspects of the classroom.
I love that. And I love that focus on joy too, right? Having that successful experience is just so rewarding for everybody, and right, reignites that spark, like you were saying earlier, being able to really enjoy teaching instead of just coming into the building every day and white knuckling it through for 8 or 9 hours or however long
Just
you're
going
there.
through the motions. I mean, I feel like the teachers, like they'll enjoy it, but there's a level of teaching where it's like, yeah, we're going through the motions. It's fine. Today was fine. And then there's a like, Oh my goodness. We had this, a child talked about loving pickles, and then all the children started talking about whether or not they like pickles or if they've ever had them before. And so we actually had a pickle tasting, experience. And it was so interesting what the children said. And we took a vote on which kind of pickles we liked. And I mean, it's such a different conversation than just, how was the day? It was fine. Like it really does. Like when you have, you can have these moments where you're focused on, help like that for this particular teacher about the pickles. It was like, I need my group to like connect. I don't know what's happening. Like they're so disparate. Like, they only play in groups of two and they're always not in the same part of the yard or classroom. And then suddenly this pickle conversation like drew everybody together. And she was so excited. It's like, I found it. I found the thing that makes all of my kids like want to talk to each other. And so sometimes things like that happen naturally and just come up. But it was, again, like her like seeking out, how do I get these kids to feel this connection with each other? And having to continue again to narrow it down, like it's not working at the circle time games, it's not working at this, but where it is working at lunchtime. At lunchtime is when we actually have conversations all together. And so I think it can really make your practice so much more interesting and make you feel that there's so much so much joy your job can give you as an educator. And it's, also kind of making you have to think really differently and deeply about your work in a way that maybe another teacher isn't, or somebody else isn't. But when we can think this deeply about our work, we give so much more, and the kids are going to keep giving us stuff back.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Alexandra. This was an awesome conversation, and it's always nice to talk to you. And
It was really great.
for listeners, please make sure you check out her podcast, Fireside Chats on the Young Mind.